Patrick Michael Hughes is a fashion and decorative arts historian. He's professor in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons School of Design in New York. He has extensive background as a fashion journalist for branded content in the hyper-digital news sector. He's a senior fashion editor and men's fashion writer for a magazine in art, photography, and fashion based in France named IRK.
So, Patrick, welcome.
Yes.
So delighted to speak to you. So, Patrick's in New York, I'm in London.
Yes. Hello. Thank you. Good evening to you, and I'll say good afternoon to anybody who is here from the States.
Shall we kick off a little bit with talking about Sargent, which is, I think, one of your particular interests? Patrick was just telling me that he spent some time in Paris. Do you want to tell us, Patrick, just quickly about what you did in Paris? Because I think that's a really interesting background to the talk.
Oh, okay. Well, in Paris, it was when I was a graduate student. I studied at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, and I was studying French Royal decorative arts from the 17th and 18th century, as well as 17th and 18th century French fashion. And we were looking at actual historical artifacts and material culture, touring all over different sort of chateaus and museum collections. It was something that really sort of opened my eyes to a certain narrative within the field when you study directly from the primary source and the object.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, should we move to the first slide and start talking about that?
Okay, I think. Yes, I mean, I start here with, of course, the big guns, and probably the one of Sargent's most famous portraits, and this is of the American Madame Gautreau. She was originally from Louisiana, and she was in Paris, and she is someone who had a tremendous reputation. When we look at this through the lens of fashion, there are a number of narratives that come to mind. Of course, the whole sort of thing, the background is the scandal of the dress, right? And the strap that was originally painted hanging off of her shoulder. And when this premiered, it was something that really caused quite a stir. It was also the coloring of her skin as well, which is something that was tremendously controversial. But what's interesting is that it was her mother who begged Sargent to please replace the strap and do not exhibit this portrait under her name. And so she is known as Madame X. And but it's kind of like putting a portrait of some major celebrity up there and saying, "Oh no, this isn't them," when everybody knows that it was them, particularly in social circles. So Sargent reluctantly repainted the strap hanging on her shoulder. The color of her skin, as I said, that too is controversial because she is so white. She is tremendously pale. But when we look closely, this is why we have the detail here of the ear. We can see there's a suggestion here almost of makeup. And the made-up face and the made-up body is not something that we're going to see for a lady of society in 1884. So this was something that was also sort of shocking. But when we really dive into this in terms of fashion history, those are the big stories that everybody knows about this painting. But when we really look at this particular garment in terms of what was really happening, there is something majorly missing, and that is foundation garments. In the sense of the décolletage is so deep in the front, and the proper way of getting dressed during this period for a woman would have been a camisole and then a corset. And therefore, there is no evidence of a camisole or a corset going on here. So there is this suggestion of, oh, Madame Gautreau, are you wearing foundation garments? Are you wearing underwear? And this is really sort of the scandal. But it's even further than that. What's wonderful about this portrait is it can also be a taking off point in a way to further fashion discussions, in the sense that we know that the strapless bra is not invented until close to 75 years later by a man named Mambouche. And Mambouche, interestingly enough, was the first American designer to show haute couture in Paris. He is also notably the one to have designed the wedding dress for Mrs. Simpson when she married Edward VIII, and they became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So
Another scandalous lady.
As yet another scandalous American woman.
Yeah.
So this this
Yeah.
dress, we see it reappearing in fashion often, whether it is on runway or in fashion editorial. I know that Vogue numerous years ago did Nicole Kidman in a dress that was very similar to this and posed her in the same way as the Sargent.
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous dress. I mean, I can't think of any woman who wouldn't want that dress because it's just divine. But as you say, I mean, you couldn't wear anything underneath it. I mean, you couldn't probably even wear a strapless bra, could you? Because it's probably quite low at the back, you know.
Yes.
So I can imagine it must have been incredibly shocking at the time. Amazing. So in the London exhibition, they had a sketch. So that was quite interesting. They put it together. And there was also, I listened to a short audio recording of a young art historian who was kind of tasked with reinterpreting and thinking about it from a different point of view. And he was suggesting that the white skin was very much a sort of very deliberate thing because she was a white woman from Louisiana. Nobody should think that she wasn't, you know, absolutely top drawer French extraction.
No, that is very interesting. And that is, I would say that it's incredibly accurate because the lineage, in a lot of ways, of people of Louisiana has always been mixed and has always been, they have Creole culture and different sort of quadroon and etc., sort of tiers of race. And that would also make a great deal of sense in terms of the way that Sargent is portraying her and the way that she wants to reinvent her story, which is a common thread in Sargent paintings and portraiture. There is a sort of selective narrative. That's kind of what we're getting here in a lot of ways.
That's so interesting because fashion has always been used for literally refashioning people and going right back to Elizabeth, you know, the first of England, you know, the sort of creating these extraordinary costumes. I've just been reviewing a book on Velasquez and the costume at the Spanish court, you know, and it's always the same thing. It's creating this image through fashion. So it's interesting that she was doing that as well. Anyway, I should say, Patrick, cheers. I forgot to say we're drinking these wonderful
cheers
Cucumber
to you.
Martinis. Yeah. So I hope our listeners are also enjoying a cocktail. Shall we move to the next slide?
Yes. Yes. Well, Mrs. Charles E. Inches, I think that this is a wonderful portrait, and it really does say so much about American fashion in a lot of ways. This is a prominent sort of Bostonian. They made their money in paper. And really what we're seeing here is a dress that has been attributed to an American copy. And I was a little disappointed that is all that it got, because it's so much more than an American copy, in the sense that America has always been accused of just copying Paris. But really what America was doing was importing Paris. Someone greatly respected in the field, Carolyn Milbank, discusses how New York specifically really sort of used Paris. The power of made in Paris, or it came from Paris, carried so much cachet. What we find in America during this time period in the late 19th century is that we're going to have a tremendous manufacturing engine, a tremendous dressmaking engine as well. And what we're going to find also is that Charles Frederick Worth is actually going to, on the very much sort of quiet, create collections for department stores, one particular one, Lord and Taylor. And it's not going to have his name in it. It's not going to be have his label in it or any of those kinds of things, but it's going to be a sort of a separate kind of collection where one could go to Lord and Taylor in New York and have the Worth experience. This is something that is, of course, Charles Frederick Worth is known as the fashion dictator. It's going to happen in what they called the salon at Lord and Taylor, which all the way until its end, the end of the company, it was the better dresses was always called the salon. It's interesting because this is actually an economic engine. This is a way that we find in a lot of ways that America is sort of supporting this industry of haute couture in France and dressmaking. And this will happen in numerous times, particularly in World War II. And we find it very much in the 1950s with specialty department stores. But this is the beginning in a lot of ways. I don't want to, I'll use the word license because that's probably a word that everybody can understand, but it is in a lot of ways the beginning of that kind of thinking in terms of letting a certain sort of product go into another market and creating revenue. And that is really sort of the bottom line here. What I also love about this dress is how absolutely subtle this is. This is so restrained, my goodness. The color, the lack of embellishment. I mean, she is a Bostonian. And the rules of sort of wearing haute couture in Boston were very different from the rules of wearing haute couture in New York or perhaps, and definitely in Paris and in Europe. Boston was tremendously conservative. And we know this from the primary sources of people like Edith Wharton. She speaks a great deal about sort of how when American women went abroad and bought trunks of Worth gowns, if you can imagine somebody buying trunks of haute couture, they often waited for a few seasons before they put it on because they
He went to Paris.
Yes, when they went in Paris. When
no,
they went,
but Worth was he was British, wasn't he?
Yes, he
Was
was
he
British.
But he worked in Paris.
He
Right.
worked
So
in
they
Paris.
went to Paris to buy
They
his
went to
things
Paris.
and brought them back. Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
yes, and brought them back and would wait to wear them. The reputation of wearing haute couture the minute that it was created was something that actually courtesans, demi-mondes, women of the stage did, which I think is very interesting. True aristocrats, you could wait on it. And a lot of that comes from the fact of something called the carte de visite, which is a small picture card about the size of a playing card that were very popular and collectible. So that sort of fashion imagery was out there and very, very popular. It's a tremendously different thing in Boston. And when we start talking about sort of high society or the American aristocrats.
It's quite lovely, isn't it? I mean, she's daring with her
Yeah, she is a little.
Yeah.
A little daring. A little daring.
Yeah.
As I said, this dress says so much more than just an American copy. It really is a statement in a lot of ways in the direction that fashion is going to go in the forthcoming century.
Yeah, beautiful. Shall we move to the next slide?
Yes. Yes, Mrs. Fisk, Gretchen Osgood. Now, this is a marvelous, we get a picture here of really Sargent working in his studio, which is really quite wonderful. And this is where we sort of can get this whole sort of sense of how much he is making up the information as well. The information of place and setting. We can take a look at the profile here of the seating furniture. It's far more embellished than the way it actually appears in the studio. So, the upright profile of the chair is something that really takes us back in a certain sort of way to Tudor or even sort of 17th century sort of profile of furniture. But the dress in this is really quite wonderful. The 19th century is the historical century. And by that, I mean, it is something where we see a number of revival styles. And this is, I mean, if we're so close to it, I believe in the slide, but I believe when we're far enough away from it, we really see sort of the patterning that Sargent had in mind here. We're seeing a lot of sort of slashing. We're seeing a certain amount of triangles in the front, etc. This harkens back to sort of late Tudor motif in a certain sort of way. The last Tudor monarch, of course, is Elizabeth I. And what we find is this revival of this Elizabethan sort of motif during the 19th century. The first instance of it is going to be with George IV and his coronation. And he is going to try and revive England, to the glory days of Elizabeth, etc. And then as we move through into the 19th century and the early 20th century, we got to get another revival of Elizabethan sort of motifs, particularly in high-end fashion and couture, probably sort of garments, etc. So this is one that really sort of speaks a great deal to the historicism that we see in Sargent's work, and really the imprint that fashion has with a historical narrative. The daughter's dress is pretty much kind of made up, I believe. She's wearing a smock that is similar, but it is, the lushness of the textile is enhanced in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think I was looking at what the catalogue had to say about this particular painting, and I think it really shows how Sargent intervened to put sisters in dresses that he really felt were the right ones, because apparently I think this woman came along with something completely different, and he said, no, we're not having that. Let's get this dress that your sister-in-law has, which is 2 sizes too large, but never mind, we'll pin it. And then the daughter's thing is a bolt of material that he's just kind of like put together around her. So, and according to the exhibition, this was his signature. He would just go in and create these dresses almost on the canvas around the sitter. And, if he didn't like the way they looked, he would invent it and recreate it and reimagine it.
Well, that is, it's almost like the role of the fashion photographer. The fashion photographer can do something like that. I've been on a number of shoots, editorial shoots, where things do not fit. And we've got sort of clips in the back. And we're just making the moment. And this is exactly what's sort of happening here, except it has taken it so much further with the decoration. She is almost enthroned, which is really kind of wonderful.
Yeah. Shall we move to the next?
Yes. Oh, goodness. Yes. This is one of those moments where it's truly about sort of, is it fashion? Is it costume? It's a little bit of both. I believe that Sargent has won here. I think that the painting is so much more magnificent than the object in terms of its richness. But it really is sort of, here is this wonderful actress, Ellen Terry, and we have this costume, I believe, is designed by Alice Carr, and she was sort of a close friend of the actresses. And what she's used here in these sort of iridescent pieces that are on the front and on the sleeve are beetle wings. And we have this iridescent sort of sense to it, but look at how very rich the color is here and its drama within the, playing Lady Macbeth. This also says so much about popular taste. This is coming into the time period where we are going to see Raphaelites coming into the fore in art and in creative circles. We have, once again, revival styles that are connected to literature. Not only sort of Macbeth, but this sort of idea of their interpretation of,
Yes.
of knights in shining armor and rescue and a certain amount of mythology around the houplanade, the long flowing sleeved garment. So this would have been something that would have, seeing this on stage would have just, been over the top. I'm not quite sure what happened to the collar. I don't think Sargent liked the velvet of the collar. He's minimized that tremendously. We see evidence of it in the painting, but it's by no means as prominent as it is in the actual garment.
Yeah, fabulous. Great. Oh, and this is wonderful.
Yes. This is one that, of course, is just filled with rich narrative, and one that I hope everybody can see the banyan on the side there. Dr. Posey at Home in 1881. This is really a magnificent portrait. We know that Sargent was in Spain, I think around 1879. So he would have seen a lot of the works, I think, of Velázquez and all of those monumental sort of Spanish works where red is dominant. This was scandalous in its own way as well. This was exhibited, and then all of a sudden, Dr. Posey, who was a noted womanizer, everybody began to sort of think about, well, what is really going on here? I know that in current studies connected to art history, fashion history, also people who are interested in queer studies have looked at this painting. Speaking purely in terms of fashion history, what is shocking about this painting is the sense of undress. And that may sound tremendously funny because he is covered to the floor. But the banyan was traditionally a at-home robe that a gentleman wore in his study. And perhaps his colleagues or members of his family may visit him in his study while he was wearing his banyan. Traditionally, the textiles of the banyan communicated an understanding of a wider world. And they would be made of fabrics that perhaps came from Asia, or perhaps fabrication that came from India, or variation thereof, or is the yellow one connected to technology in fabric, which is sort of a damask, and the damask loom, which is something that is considered one of the earliest forms of computer in a way. So these would have been textiles that communicated a certain sense of a wider world. And as I said, he would have worn this in his study, and the study would have been surrounded by accoutrement of who he was, books, articles of learning, etc. But all of that is absent here. And what we're seeing is almost like he's appearing from, the side of a bed. I like to think, because I know he was an opera fan, he looks as though he's appearing from an opera box. So it is this sort of daring step into the public with this solid red robe. I love also the historicism here in terms of this garment. We take a look at his shirt. It is tremendously reminiscent of Titian's Man with the Glove. Same with the pleating at the edge here by the hand. And the collar of the actual banyan is one that takes us back to almost a Van Dyck collar. So the imprint of history is here. The only thing that is sort of truly embellished are his shoes. That's truly when it becomes sort of a slipper. And that particular type of shoe probably would have been a bit risque at the time, it's just a little too intimate. We're getting a great deal of information about him. We know that he was part of bohemian circles as well as literary circles and etc. We know that Sargent was also someone who was connected to Giovanni Boldini. And the whole sort of look of Boldini's capturing of these types of men that were around, like Montesquieu. The Montesquieu portrait is a bit later, but there is almost the same book that is being read here in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. So interesting about the sort of the message about somebody who understands the wider world. I hadn't taken that in, but it does feel very intimate. Yeah, fascinating. He came to a bad end, poor old Potsy. Apparently he got murdered by one of his patients, didn't he?
Yes, the murder. Yeah. But what's so interesting about this, because this painting, he is really in his prime. He is really, and with the help of Sargent, he's probably even looking more like he's in his prime. And I know when Potsy was murdered, he requested to be buried in his military uniform, of all things. And he was quite a portly man when he was killed. So this is almost like Dorian Gray in a way. This is a truly golden moment.
Wonderful. What have we got next?
Oh, Lady Helen Vincent. I particularly really love this, and I put this next to a portrait by Pompeo Battoni. Pompeo Battoni is one of my favorite sort of painters when I speak about the 18th century in terms of fashion history. He was the painter that young gentlemen who were on a grand tour went to have their portrait done in Italy. You had to have your portrait done by Battoni. What's so wonderful about it is that they would have these portraits done, and then they, of course, on the grand tour, they are shopping. They are buying accoutrement, furniture, paintings, all kinds of things, and shipping them back to their country homes in England and back in the UK. And I think that this sort of pose, this sort of portraiture would have been very familiar to Sargent. When we take a look here at Helen Vincent and the way that she is posed, I think it is tremendously interesting in the sense that it is one almost of intellect. But we know that she was somebody who was a highly connected society sort of hostess, in the know in a lot of ways. What we also see here is yet another imaginary garment from Sargent. And this enormous pink shawl that almost reminds us of Van Dyck in a certain sort of way. It takes us back to certain sorts of 17th century portraits, this almost classical drape that is around her against this tremendously Edwardian frame. The corsetry that she would have been wearing underneath this, I think, is highly fashionable. But as opposed to the Battoni, where we see him surrounded by the hues of knowledge and learning, hers are absent. And what we see is architecture that says constant and steadfast, the balustrade, and we get the wainscoting and all of these sorts of this almost like this cloth of state that is hung behind her in this magnificent sort of red. It's almost a little bit of an arrogance that she is the stable society. She is the new society. It's all communicated also through dress here as well, this exquisite fabrication, and of course, jewelry. The pearls are just the opera length pearls, I believe is what we call it now. Those are truly magnificent. True Edwardian booty, as one would say, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So she is the decorative object, isn't she?
She is the decorative object. Yes, she is the decorative object. And that's what's so interesting.
Yeah. This is Carmencita, the Spanish dancer, right?
Yes, Carmencita is really quite wonderful. When she was here in New York, she was performing at a theater that was attached to a tremendously large beer garden. This was not high art. This was a little bit risque, but I think it's a wonderful insight also to perhaps the way that Sargent spent his time, because he became obsessed with her. This was a place that is, it was on 23rd Street and 6th Avenue, which is an area that has historically had a Spanish community in a way. But this is a little bit of the difference between fashion and costume. And this is costume. This is definitely something that would have been magnificent for the stage. But once again, I mean, the way she's sort of standing, it brings us back to the Goya and his time also in Spain.
Yeah, absolutely. In the exhibition, they had a clip, which is probably on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it. Her just twirling and twirling and twirling. It was amazing.
Oh, yes. Really, now, this is the time period where we're going to start to see performers, people like Loie Fuller, who is going to work with Thomas Edison, and of course, the time period of Isadora Duncan, the mother of American modern dance. But it is a different audience than Isadora or Loie Fuller. Shall we go on? Good.
Yeah,
yes.
We must have this one. I love it.
Yes.
This is almost my favorite one.
Yes. Mrs. Karl Meyer and her children, we have to mention the Jewish patronage of Sargent. Sargent has always had a strong connection to Jewish artists and also to Jewish patrons. And I think that is something that's tremendously important when we start to think about this invention of society and this sort of ascendance that he gives his sitters. But when we look at Mrs. Meyer's dress, and I have it here with Marquis de Pompadour, the front of the dress, it is taking from the robe à la française. Once again, this revival of 18th century fashion. She has on a shoe that is reminiscent of the mules of the time. The way she's sort of seated, not quite as cast back as the Marquis, but similar in a lot of ways. The seating furniture here is just magnificent. Probably some sort of a Bouvet kind of tapestry. We look at the top of the chair and the movement in the legs. And then we see here in the clothing a transitional look that is sort of taking us into the 20th century. Once again, 18th century revivalism. This probably would have been a dress that we would have found at a couturier like Worth, more than likely like a Piguet. Émile Piguet was just sort of beginning around 1890 in Paris. It's sort of a really magnificent Edwardian full skirt. And we can see that this is going to be rustling out of fashion by the time we really start to move forward.
It's so beautiful. Two things that really strike me. I love the little foot peeping through, as it does in the Marquise Pompadour over there, but also the instability. He's got her almost tipping forward to create this sense of dynamism. You know, it's all moving, isn't it? It's not at all a static image. And he does that by almost making her as if she's about to slide off the chair. It's very, very clever.
Yeah, there is a temporality to this. It's really, really wonderful. Lady Sassoon, yet again, the wonderful Jewish patronage that we have with Sargent. And this is 1907, and here we are truly in the midst of Edwardian fashion and the opera cloak here. So I've read that this was not particularly a favorite of hers. It's very difficult, I think, to render this much black fabrication successfully with a black background and the hat. But this pink and black, the opera cloak is something that is tremendously important in fashion during this period because the opera was still a place of socialization. I don't think that this is the most fashionable opera coat. I think that the better ones would have come from the House of Doucet, Jacques Doucet. This is sort of a Worth-like garment. And by 1907, Worth is no longer the only label. It's actually Jean-Philippe Worth who was creating for the house, Charles Frederick Worth's son. And what we're seeing is something that's already beginning to look a little old. You know, my fashion criticism would be that it's aging her. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's void of the fashion of the time in the sense of there is no evidence of Art Nouveau. There is no evidence of sort of the art movements that would have been tremendously popular in textile during this period.
I mean, I covered it from a different point of view. I covered it, you know, as somebody who's looked at quite a lot of Velázquez, and I think what he's doing is, because Velázquez painted black, and goodness me, he painted black so many different ways, and different textures of black, different fabrics in black, different decorations. And I think he's showing us, I think he's trying to show us, I can do black too. And the way he takes that little bit of the pink, the lining, and he turns it back, flashes it down her waist. And it's brilliant. I mean, I think this is an example where you really need the painting to understand why the garment was interesting. This was right at the front of the show in London. And in this case, the painting just wins hands down because it kind of really needs her in it because she is beautiful. I think it works in the flesh, you know, when you see the painting. It doesn't look so good on screen, but it is a rather wonderful painting. Maybe that's a good place to end. What do you think, Patrick? And
yes, I think that's fine.
Yeah. I think we should let Patrick go and enjoy the rest of his cocktail. I noticed he hasn't been sipping. He's probably been a little bit careful. Patrick, shall we share the recipe for the cocktail we've been drinking?
I think it's
There it is. So here's the recipe. I have been enjoying mine very much, but my goodness, I've only had a tiny bit and I can already feel it. Gone straight to the head.
Well, it's a good summer cocktail, a wonderful cucumber martini. So a little bit different.
Great. Well, enjoy your cocktail. And thank you again for a really lovely and very, very interesting talk. Yeah. Hope to speak to you again on another topic at some point soon.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me and for having me. And thank you, everybody, for attending. This is a tremendous honor and, something that I really enjoyed pulling together.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees. Have a lovely evening and hope to see you again at another event soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.